that is where the contention will basically be. Why does 89106 need $100 million? What I want to basically do is be able to come back before this board with a proposal with a Blackstone to Jeremy, so he can go ahead and do the due diligence and come back for the October meeting so we can sit down and determine which proposal truly is better for the schools, for the hospitals, for the sports and the little leagues and everything else, UNLV. That's all we want to do, is have an opportunity to show you how we can leverage that $100 million into billions of dollars, very much so in a 7-year fund with Blackstone's assistance. That's all we're talking about, Mr. Chair. We want to be in the game and we can contribute. So this business about we're ransom and we're charity, no. We're talking about a rate of return that far exceeds whatever the raters can even think about in this particular transaction. So I'm going to leave it there because of the 2.5 minutes. The rest of the stuff we can go ahead and get into. If we're going to start construction in November, I certainly need to know about the project labor agreement. That needs to be negotiated. The CBA calls for that. We haven't seen it, the community. So the idea that construction would start in November without a balanced negotiated labor agreement is beyond me. We're certainly looking for Bill Stanley and the labor community to sit down with us on that as we move forward. We don't want to see any project delays, but we don't want to be excluded. And if that means we have to go to 2021, so be it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Washington. Thank you, ma'am. Welcome.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, board members. My name is J.C. Clark. I'm with North Cap Commercial Real Estate. I'm a local real estate broker here in Las Vegas at 1127 South Rancho, 89102. I represent the Michael Lewis Group. They finance infrastructure projects and public projects such as stadiums and other transportation types of projects. I believe I provided everybody with a letter. So they've expressed interest, and they had planned to be here today. They had an emergency they had to attend to in Michigan, so they send their apologies. They're interested in assisting with the funding, and although they realize that those might be secured, they wanted to present that they could fund to a large amount. We know that we need probably transportation or parking garages. So if the fund hadn't been secured, they want an opportunity to have that and to present it, and they plan on coming back here in October. So he's got his the letters I provided to you, his name and address, emails on there, so I would defer any questions to him on any additional information.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Clark.
Thank you.
Please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Gene Collins, and I'm in total almost agreement with what, matter of fact, I'm in agreement with what Mr. Washington read, except he mentioned a 9-member board. What we discussed, we wanted a 7-member board. And when you talk about the incubators and stuff like this, we want you all to know that this isn't new for us. We did this 25 or 30 years ago in our historical West Side community. Excuse me, Mr. Chairman, I thought this was off. So what we did, the incubator concept was the first idea that we brought to this community, we brought to the table. And what that does, it's gives us an opportunity to hire, train, and go into business within our community. And the reason why that you don't have any more than what you have, because we didn't want to put our laundry list out on the table, because we wanted to come back, Mr. Washington kind of touched on it a little bit, we wanted to come back with a detailed agenda showing you how that we are going to spend the money on, from safety to creating jobs to loaning, the whole 9 yards, that this is what we have. So this is one of the few times that we are not going to come up here and kind of rake anybody over the coals about what is not happening. I want to thank you for giving me an opportunity to come up and hopefully come back, because think that we need to take action on one of these proposals, because our community is totally different than where the area and where you all are from. What goes on in your community doesn't go in ours. So we have to look at for the historical West Side community and those students and those kids. And so we will have you an agenda when we come back, and we will spell out how we're going to spend the money. Thank you.
Mr. Collins. Sir.
Hello, my name is Leon Harris, and I came up here to talk about the good of what the Raiders has done in the community. And I got this paper, but I don't need that. I grew up in Richmond, California. I grew up in the Bay Area. And, some of the people in here, they're saying that the Raiders is not going to come and support our community, but they don't know about when the Raiders actually help the preschool buy books. They don't know about when the Raiders joined the Black Panthers and helped provide breakfast for the Head Start kids that was in elementary school. I don't need this paper to talk about what the Raiders been doing in the community. You can check their history and find out that yourself. But I want to, as a Black American living in Las Vegas, I want to make a statement about some of our Black leaders. Some of our leaders here, they own construction companies, union construction companies, and
I'm actually going to tell you a different story, because I'm not a Richmond resident, but I'm an Oakland, California resident. Born and raised. This right here, it says 102nd, for 102nd and Walnut. Just like Las Vegas is Sin City, Oakland, unfortunately, is a city of dope. Okay? Our communities in Oakland and East Oakland are suffering. Our kids in the Black community are killing each other. The stadium is in the middle of the ghetto. It's on 73rd. In our ghettos where kids die every day. Those programs that he's talking about is lipstick on a pig. It does little to help our community. And that's why Oakland left Oakland, California, because the Oakland community wasn't going to pay for that stadium. I've been in Oakland my whole life. I moved here in 2012. I am 33. My mom had 10 kids. I am the youngest of 10. In the 80s, when crack cocaine hit Oakland, it destroyed our community. And these businesses helped only because they were forced to. Because they knew the Black Panthers was about no justice, no peace. My mother and my father are both Black Panthers. I am a Black Panther baby. Okay? So don't sit here and try to put lipstick on a pig. Because I get very emotional when you play on the hearts of my community, not only as an African American and a direct descendant of slaves. Okay, let's talk about the reality. So this benefits agreement is very, very hot topic in the Black community, and we are not getting heard. I had a meeting with Senator. He was there. We had a meeting with Senator Ford and Senator Atkinson. We talked about what was going to happen. When that little bill came, I told everybody, Gene Collins, we both said that was a horrible written bill. It didn't even say anything. You guys, when the bill was written, y'all knew exactly how many was going to be on y'all committee, everything was written out in that bill. For the community benefit, it is very generic. It says the Raiders and the Community Development Committee is supposed to develop a community benefits agreement for the community without the community input? What type of community benefit plan is that? It doesn't benefit the community, it benefits the businesses and you guys' bottom line, which is y'all pockets. We are tired of you guys making millions off of us. And you say when we ask for something, it's a handout. We don't ask for a handout, we ask for a hand up.
Afternoon. Hello, everybody. John Stevens, Coalition of Black Trade Unions. Once again, hello, everybody. Just want to drop off this letter, follow up from the last letter I dropped off. And once again, we are here to help. Anything I haven't heard from anybody on the committee or anybody, I heard from one person just to ask me how to spell Coalition of Black Trade Unionists. So anyway, I'm here, John Stevens. Thank you, guys. Have a good day.
Thank you, Mr. Stevens. Any other?
Good morning.
Welcome.
My name is Dan O'Shea with the Nevada Contractors Association. I'm the Director of Labor Relations, and we are currently negotiating the PLA between the building trades, craft unions, and the contractor. Maybe there's a little confusion how PLAs are negotiated. They're a contract between the general contractor and the building trade craft unions with input and direction from the owner. All those meetings are going on right now. The directions from the owner are crystal clear. So much so that the unions have made exceptions to their collective bargaining agreements to allow people that are not of signatory status to participate in this project, and there's avenues for them to get it. We also represent the largest diversity committee in this town with 162 diverse contractors on it. All these things are going on, but nobody negotiates PLAs in a public venue. Nobody.
Thank you, Mr. O'Shea. Sir?
Good afternoon. How you doing? Archie Walden, Labor's Local 872 Training Director. Once again, we hear how a community is being besieged and not given an opportunity to participate in anything that goes on in the city, without forgetting that I don't live in 89106 or 89030. I've got two sons that are both black, live in 89178 with me, and a plethora of friends they have that it sounds like, even though they may be interested in construction, aren't going to get the same opportunity everybody else in the city gets. And it's not just, about being an African American. I have to represent my whole union, which means I have Hispanic people, I have Asian people, I have Caucasian people, I have people from the Pacific Islander, I have people from all walks of life. So I don't open up my program based on somebody's ethnicity. I've just been doing meetings with the people over at the LGBTQ community with Andre Wade. I just met this afternoon again with Ahmad Ade over at the Muslim Mosque over in West Las Vegas. I've outreached to the Latino community with Peter Guzman over here. We can't just look at one person and say we're going to bring you in because you're black or you're white or you're Hispanic or whatever the case may be. We have to look at the community as a whole, because this isn't just for us, it's for everybody here in Southern Nevada. And what it looks like, we have a group of people with this big giant plate that everybody's going to eat off of, but they want their little section and be damned with everybody else over here. They're not worried about everybody else over here. They're just worried about their one little section. And if they don't get theirs, nobody's going to get anything else. They would rather watch this whole city suffer behind their games and their shenanigans than let everybody, come up and enjoy what's the fruits of the labor that are going to come out of this. So this isn't a personal attack. This is just for everybody to take a look at the situation that we're in and what we're going through, what we're doing, the businesses that are going to be created as a result of this. I've seen the Raiders' record and what they've done in Oakland and LA, and I'm sorry to this young man that he went through what he went through, but sometimes your community has to bring yourself up yourself. Okay, you can't always look for a handout from the outside to do what you've got to do inside your own community. And that's not just me being a butthole, whatever you want to call it. That's just the honest truth. Okay, my father had 20 brothers and sisters. Okay, he grew up in a house like the Flintstones. He doesn't live there anymore. And he didn't expect the same thing out of his own children. So where you come to and where you come from doesn't determine who you are. What you want out of your life, what drive you have, what initiative you take is going to determine where you go to. And that goes for anybody in this room, especially my apprentices over here. I went through that program 17 years ago. I was an apprentice sitting over there. I was a single father raising a son that was 3 years old. I lost everything. I was working a job making $8 an hour. That's where I'm at today. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Mr. Walden. Anybody else? Okay, thank you. We will close agenda item 2, open agenda item 3. If the board has had an opportunity to look at the agenda, are there any recommendations for inclusion of emergency items or deletion of any of the agenda items? And if not, I'd entertain a motion to approve the agenda.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Okay, thank you. That passes unanimously. In agenda item 4, I will just make a few comments, kind of set a little bit of the framework for the meeting today. Jeremy will certainly discuss these issues in more detail as we get to these agenda items. a week or two ago, Mr. Guerrero put out a memo to the board, and I think the public's had an opportunity to look at that, explaining that we will consider today during the meeting extending the date for when all of these agreements that we need to put together will be finalized and hopefully signed. And the main driver of that is that the law in the state of Nevada that was passed during the special session recently, and frankly, from a developer and owner standpoint, this certainly makes sense, but the law requires that there is a firm fixed price contract for the construction of the stadium. That is to protect the public. It is certainly in the best interest of the owners, and in order to provide enough engineering work in order to allow the contractors on the project to provide that firm fixed price, there's additional time that's needed. They feel they need plans at a 65% completion level, and we think that will take until January or February to accomplish. That timing works just fine for the overall schedule for the stadium construction and for the work that the Stadium Authority needs to do with the Raiders. But in order to allow that to happen, you'll see, I think it's in agenda item 11, that there is an MOU draft that has been prepared that you've had an opportunity to look at that would allow the Raiders and the Stadium Development Company to move forward on the steps that they need to take in order to stay on schedule in accordance with what will be a new schedule for getting documentation done. So when we get to those items, Jeremy can explain those in more detail and certainly ask or answer any questions you may have.
A MOU is a memorandum of understanding.
Way and is certainly in keeping with both the law and the spirit of the working relationship that we have developed with the Raiders. And then as we work our way through the agenda, you'll see in the last agenda items, there will be drafts of the findings that probably won't be signed until all of those documents are signed in February. But quite a bit of work has been done not only on those findings, but on the backup information that is necessary in order for those findings to be approved and executed. So those are kind of just a brief explanation of several of the agenda items today. The other will be, that I'll point out, work that has been really accomplished on the community benefit plan. I want to thank everybody involved who's done so much work over the past several weeks in order to make quite a bit of progress. We do think in that area that we have pretty significant opportunity to bring back a document that it will be complete in form for the board to review at the next meeting in October, but quite a bit has been accomplished over the last several weeks. So I want to thank the Raiders and their team for their work. Certainly Jeremy and his folks have put in quite a bit of work on that as well, as has Senator Ford and many members of the community. So we'll also get to that. With that, I'll close agenda item 4 unless any member of the board has a comment that they would like to make before we move on. And seeing none, we'll open agenda item 5, which is the approval of the minutes from the August 17th, 2017 meeting. If the board has had an opportunity to review those, I'd entertain any suggestions for changes, and if not, I'd entertain a motion for approval. We have a motion. Do we have a second?
Second motion.
I have a second. Any further discussion on the minutes? Okay, all in favor, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? Okay, that passes unanimously as well. So we'll open agenda item 6 and get an update from Mr. Guerrero on any items that he'd like to discuss today.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate the opportunity to be here today. Quick update in terms of where we are on all of the project documents. I just wanted to make sure that I ran through these so that the Stadium Authority Board was clear that we are continuing to move forward on all fronts, respecting the fact that we are extending the timeline in order to meet the conditions of Senate Bill 1. That hasn't stopped the effort on any of the fronts that we discussed last time. The lease agreement, as you were well aware, has been approved in form. There's a couple of issues that could potentially require some cleanup, but other than that, that document is completed. The development agreement has been developed and submitted to the raters by Mr. Arnold and his team. They continue to be reviewing that, respecting the fact, as the chairman indicated, there are some other technical issues that will ultimately need to be completed in order to finalize that. The non-relocation agreement that you reviewed last meeting, all of the outstanding items have been completed. There's a couple of minor items relative to how the damages will be set out. We need to circle back with the raters. That is not that hasn't pushed forward. It's just we haven't had a time to sit down and finalize those pieces. The PSL marketing and sales agreement, we have submitted that to the other parties, including Clark County, and received feedback and provided some additional information to them as necessary and appropriate. We believe that that document is materially finished as well. The PSL purchase and sales agreement continues to be with the raters, their team, their attorneys at Morgan Lewis. We look forward to receiving that. The estoppel and recognition agreements, both the senior and subordinated agreements, were both reviewed by this committee. We believe that all of the material provisions of those documents are completed today. On your agenda today, as the chairman indicated, are the Section 29.1 findings. There are 7 of them. We believe that all of those are also complete as to form, and we are pleased to indicate that. The land transfer agreement, essentially the agreement that allows, calls for the transfer of land from the raters to the Stadium Authority Board, has been completed by Brownstein Hyatt Farber Schreck and has been submitted to the raters for their review and consideration, as has a due diligence checklist relative to that. We look forward to their review and response to that.
They haven't
The
signed
financing
it.
and transaction agreement, which is underway with Clark County, continues to be underway. They, as well as their financial advisors, are working through that document, thinking through exactly how the parties need to be structured, but there has been significant progress over the last 30 days, and I do want to extend my thanks not only to the county, but also to Guy Hobbs and his team, who's been instrumental in getting that done. The resolution, of course, to extend the timeline is in your document. I do want to extend my thanks both to Mr. Arnold and Brownstein Hyatt Farber Schreck for getting that pulled together for you as well. There are also a series of documents that are more technical in nature, not necessarily to be brought before the Stadium Authority Board, but will be attachments or references in other documents. These include the team use agreement, the leasehold mortgage agreement, sometimes referred to as the credit agreement, the assignment of leases and rents, the credit security agreement, the furniture financing statement, and then some of the construction and design agreements. Mr. Arnold and his team are working with the folks at Morgan Lewis, as well as the raters and other attorneys on this to get that completed. All of those appear to be making solid progress and continue to be on track. The last 2 agreements that I wanted to mention, one the chairman alluded to, and we'll talk more about it in a moment, is the community benefit plan. I too want to extend my thanks for all involved who have provided input relative to that. It has been taken up a significant amount of our time over the last 30 days and remains a primary commitment of your staff in terms of getting that completed. The UNLV joint use agreement continues to make progress. There's discussions going on between UNLV and the Raiders organization. There was some preliminary conversation about that at the Board of Regents. We continue to encourage those parties to complete that and try to keep the timeline as short as possible. Again, the 3 things that we have brought up before this committee as being critically important is the maintenance of the asset, the maximization of the asset, and ensuring the game day experience for UNLV. We continue to be focused on that and will continue to do so as well. I believe the Raiders are going to speak somewhat on the land use and development
Still a long way to
agreement
go.
process. Last week,
See?
the county commission unanimously approved the special land use permit that has been provided and is in your packet. I don't intend to go through it in a substantial amount of detail, but I do want to make sure that I point out that what Mr. Arnold is going to talk about today in terms of the enabling works MOU, as well as the process, we are trying to be as consistent as we can with the development agreement and land use process at the county. There are certain conditions that I believe there are 15 of them that are on the fourth to last page of that agreement. Those are things that say what the raters are allowed to do and what the raters are not allowed to do under that land use permit. And again, that enabling works MOU has attempted to be consistent with the type of work that can go on until the development agreement is ultimately completed. I have had the opportunity to also talk to the county staff relative to the process of the development agreement. They indicate that that is going extremely well, that they have rallied all of the county departments relative to that development agreement, and that continues to progress. They think it's going to be in October when they will have that completed and before the county commission, so that ought to be well in advance of the February timeline that we're looking at for some of the other documents. So again, we extend our thanks to all of those parties. Mr. Chairman, in terms of the public comment submissions that are included in your packet, there are a few of them, some of which have been also submitted to you today. I do want to draw your attention to a new traffic study from Mr. Tony Marnell. That is, we have had the opportunity to review that and have submitted it for the board's consideration. There's also the CBA request from the concerned citizens of historic West and North Las Vegas that is included as part of your board materials, as well as the information that was alluded to today, but I wanted to make sure that that was indicated as being part of the public record. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to turn it over to Brian Haynes to just very briefly talk about where we are in terms of making some of the changes that Member Evans had requested in terms of the vendor request application and communication there, as well as just to give the board an update relative to revenue collection. Mr. Chairman, just one other thing. You had asked that we routinely bring back sort of financial progress updates. We had talked about doing that for this meeting, but given the length of the agenda and the fact that we'll have quarterly information the next time we get together, we just deferred that until the next meeting, and that will be on your agenda for next go-round.
We'll let you off the hook with that one.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Haynes.
For the record, Brian Haynes. Just a quick update on our vendor registration numbers. The pace has slowed a bit, but we are up to 400 total registrations. About 240 of those are small businesses under the SB1 definition. Related to that, we did create a frequently asked questions document related to the definition of a small local business. This was in response to some of the feedback that we've received and some questions from some folks who wanted to register and weren't sure if their businesses met that.
He doesn't say whether they're women or minority. Note that.
Authority website to help guide that process a little bit better. In regards to Mr. Evans, your inquiry last meeting about email notification for registrants, we have now added that. So now whenever someone submits their registration to the vendor system, they'll get an automated reply that confirms confirms their information. And we also sent out an email to everyone who had registered up to that point, just to give them a physical email that they can have as confirmation that they are indeed in the system.
Thank you, Mr. Haynes. Did you want to talk about the financial information that's included?
Let's talk about room tax revenue. We closed up our fiscal year through June. June itself was $3.9 million, about 14% ahead of our budget. For the 4 months, March through June, which was our complete fiscal year, total revenue was about $17.2 million, which is about $2.4 million ahead of our budgeted amount, or about 16%. And so far for July, preliminary collections were about $4 million, or also above, about 5% ahead of our budgeted amount.
What about August?
Thank you, Mr. Haynes. Any questions for either Mr. Guerra or Mr. Haynes? Mr. Evans?
Yep. Thank you, Mr. Chair. For the record, Ken Evans. Want to say thank you very much to staff for going through and completing those notifications. I already know a couple of individuals that notified me to let me know that those steps have been completed. What I also want to say at this time is that, Mr. Chair, I'll have further comments as it relates to this part of the process and the community benefits agreement, as well as both the developer entity and the operating entity, because that has to do with how we're going to make sure that we meet the small business participation rate, as well as making sure that there's diversity and inclusion in all phases of the stadium. So I'll wait for those times.
Thank you, Mr. Evans. Anybody else? I will point out that the list of documents that we have seems to continue to grow.
Yep.
And I hope that we can maybe stop that. But I count, and not all of these relate to the Stadium Authority Board, but a month or two ago we were at 14 and now we're at 32.
Yep, that's right.
Mr. Chairman, the brief answer to your question is yes. The longer answer to your question is there are sub-documents underneath some of these documents. And while Mr. Arnold reminds me from time to time of that brevity is the better part of valor, that we will do everything we can to try and minimize the amount of paperwork the Stadium Authority Board has to go through.
I know that's true. But as long as the postponing by 4 or 5 months doesn't just add to your workload, that'd be great. So anyway, I do appreciate all the work that both of you have done, your whole teams, and certainly the Raiders and their combined teams. When we started this process, we thought, hey, we're going to sign a development agreement and a lease, and this is going to be pretty straightforward. And it's more complex than that. So thank you for everybody who's done so much work over the past months. Okay, we will move on to agenda item 7, which is an agenda item to consider and possibly approve, adopt, and authorize the Stadium Authority Chairman to sign a resolution to extend to 18 months from the current 12 months the time frame for project approval and the agreements to be executed. And I'll let Jeremy get further into this, but at the beginning of Section 29 of the Southern Nevada Tourism Infrastructure Act, which is the SB 1 bill that was passed during the special session for these topics, Section 1, subsection 1 of Section 29 talks about the timeframes that are available for the Stadium Authority to work through this with an NFL team, which is obviously the Raiders, as well as the National Football League. And Section 29.1 says the Stadium Authority shall negotiate and may enter into a development agreement and a lease agreement to comply with subsections 2 and 3 as applicable if the Board of Directors. And then in subsection B, it goes on to say within 12 months after the effective date of sections 21 to 37 inclusive of this act, or if the board determines that an extension of this period is necessary or desirable within 18 months after that effective date, finds that the National Football League team is committed to locate or relocate within the stadium district. And then it goes on through some of the other 29.1 issues that we'll deal with later in the meeting that we have to issue findings on in order to finalize this. But the law itself is very clear that the board has the complete discretion to extend the time frame from 12 to 18 months. It's a recommendation that we make at this point. If not, we would have to be concluded with all this by October 17th, which, given what we discussed earlier, is simply not possible to do. So, Jeremy, if you would like to add anything to that, feel free.
Mr. Chairman, for the record, Jeremy Aguero, I don't know that I necessarily have anything to add. If it would be helpful, I'd be more than happy to walk through the elements of the resolution to make sure that the record is complete in that regard.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you.
Committee members, I'm referencing page tab number 7 within your board books, there are two documents that are included in tab number 7. The first of those is the memorandum that was submitted to the chairman and distributed to the entire board and made public relative to the reasoning behind this particular resolution. This resolution has been drafted in order to essentially complete that record. This is relatively brief. It's only 2 pages, and so I'll just walk through these whereases as well as what the ultimate determination is. And really, all I'm doing is reiterating exactly what the chairman just indicated. Whereas number 1 essentially says that Senate Bill 1 exists, and we have the Southern Nevada Tourism Improvements Act that was passed. That's what we operate on. Whereas number 2 talks about what the act allows: the acquisition, financing, construction, lease, improvement, equipping, operations and maintenance of the National Football League Stadium in Clark County, Nevada, certainly complying with that. The third, whereas, it indicates that the Stadium Authority Board shall negotiate and may enter into both a development agreement as well as a lease agreement. 2 references are included there. Again, the idea that those were the only agreements is certainly part of the original concept. The fourth whereas deals specifically with the development agreement and lease agreement, makes certain that there have to be certain findings. This is the section 29.1 findings that we have talked about previously. Again, we'll talk more about those later today. The last 2 whereases on page 1, there are 2 references where the chairman's reference to that being both necessary or desirable to extend from 12 months to 18 months is at the discretion of the board. That is included in section 29 as well as section 37 of Senate Bill 1. So we wanted to make sure we had both bases covered. The first whereas on the top of page 2 just indicates that those findings have yet to be made. They remain pending as of today. The second whereas on page 2 indicates that the board has received a memorandum from staff outlining all of the reasoning that's laid out here today, and the salient findings of that reasoning are laid out in whereas number 3, not the least of which is the concept, again, exactly what the chairman had indicated: a guaranteed maximum price contract is necessary, and that, as Mr. Webb had indicated in the last meeting, they need some more time to get that done. The target date would be February of 2018 to get that work completed. Whereas the final whereas is the one that's probably most important, and that is that the board, having received and reviewed the memorandum and having considered all relevant facts, including the fact that the design, build, contract, and pre-development activities, among other agreements and matters that are pending, are necessary prerequisites to entering into the development agreement and the lease agreement, believes it necessary and desirable to exercise each of the provided extensions in Senate Bill 1. The last one simply resolves the Stadium Authority Board has made that determination, and that it is so moved and determined by this board, so we can move forward under that new revised timeline. With that, Mr. Chairman, if there are any questions, we certainly stand ready to answer them.
There are questions for Mr. Guerrero? Okay. Seeing none, I would then entertain a motion to approve, adopt, and authorize the chairman to sign a resolution to extend to 18 months the time frame for the Clark County Stadium Authority Approval Project Development Agreement is authorized by Section 29 of Senate Bill 1.
For the record, Ken Evans, so move.
Second. We have a motion and a second. Do we have any further discussion? All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Okay, that passes unanimously. Thank you. We'll open agenda item 8 and receive status report from the Raiders. Welcome, Mr. Bedane. Nice win on Sunday.
Thank you. I think Coach Del Rio and his staff had the team well prepared to open the season. That's a tough place to win, and from the opening kickoff recovery, you could just tell that the team was well prepared. So unfortunately, you don't get to enjoy the victories as much as you agonize over the losses. So you enjoy it for about a day, and then you move on to the Jets. So hopefully they can keep it going this week. Just wanted to start by wishing a happy belated birthday to Dallas Hahn. Happy birthday. He shares a birthday with my father, which was yesterday, and felt it was appropriate to embarrass him in front of this group. I don't have a lot to add today. In addition to all the work that Jeremy and yourself has mentioned, we've had some significant accomplishments since we were here about a month ago. We did get FAA approval on the project. When we were here last month, you heard from Elliot McCabe at Bank of America, and as of the close of business today, we should be completely closed with our financing. So there's probably still a few signatures to collect, but all that work has been completed. So that's a big step for us. And lastly, you've mentioned the Clark County High Impact Project submission, getting us the conditional use permit. There was a tremendous amount of work that went into it. A lot of people here, we thank you for the work that you put into it, Jeremy, your staff. But I would like to at least publicly acknowledge the members of the County Commission, and in particular Nancy Amundsen and her staff. They sprung into action a few months ago and worked very closely with our project team, and the amount of work, I don't know if she's in the room, but I just wanted to acknowledge her publicly on the record and thank her from the Raiders. I don't have anything else to add. I'm happy to answer any questions if there are any now or later as we continue through the agenda.
Thank you, Mr. Bedane, and congratulations, Dallas. Any questions for Mr. Bedane? Okay, thank you.
Wow, no questions. That's wild.
We'll open agenda item 9 and turn it back over to Mr. Guerrero to talk about the preliminary list of development considerations.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For the record, Jeremy Aguero. At the last meeting, the Stadium Authority Board had directed staff to compile a list of preliminary development considerations. The collection of these considerations is consistent with Senate Bill 1, Section 29, 2A and B. This references the development agreement and specifically says a development agreement for the National Football League Stadium entered into by the Stadium Authority with the developer partner selected by the Board of Directors pursuant to other paragraphs must require the location, design, fit, and finish of the National Football League Stadium project to be consistent with a first-class premier National Football League facility currently in operation or approved for construction by the National Football League. It goes on to say that the site has to be identified as part of that, and it has to set forth the overall design, scope, specifications of the project, which must include without limitation an enclosed football stadium with a seating capacity of approximately 65,000 folks. So some of those words in there in terms of location, design, fit, and finish, design, scope, and specifications. The idea was to provide some framework in terms of what the Stadium Authority Board wanted to understand about the project. I want to make sure we're clear with this. The intent here is not to try and substitute the Stadium Authority Boards or your staff's board's judgment for that of the Raiders or their development team, but rather to have an understanding of what is being constructed so that we make sure that the standard that is set forth in Senate Bill 1, Section 29.2 are ultimately fulfilled when this board evaluates that for approval. With that, that list has been included in your packet. We have submitted that to the Raiders organization. I want to thank the board. We got multiple comments in terms of, hey, don't forget this or include that. So I am very thankful for all of the input that we received. And again, the whole purpose of putting it on the agenda today is to make sure that it's part of the public discussion. So if there's anything that we are missing or not considering, we certainly always would appreciate including any additional input and making sure that that is complete as possible. We are now working with the Raiders to determine how to get that information back from them. We imagine that will be a little bit of a process, but they have certainly been cooperative throughout that entire effort, and we're looking forward to getting the additional information about the development itself to the board.
Yeah, I want to reiterate the appreciation for members of the board, members of the construction industry in Southern Nevada for their input on this document. It's obviously quite comprehensive. And as Jeremy mentioned, this is not intended to be the Stadium Authority turning into stadium architects, but we have the responsibility ultimately to approve the design of the stadium, and it includes many of these details. We frankly don't anticipate that the Raiders and everybody they have working on this project are going to forget to put concession stand in, but we just want to make sure that we make a list of all the boxes that need to be checked and make sure that those boxes have indeed been checked. There will certainly be other areas that may allow the board to raise questions along the way. But I think that process is moving forward. I want to thank the Raiders for their cooperation in both helping to put this together, but also their willingness to start sharing that information as they develop it relatively soon. What we certainly don't want to do is get to the point where the stadium's designed, done, and if we have questions or comments, they really don't have the opportunity to be considered. We're faced with a very difficult choice at that point. So we are, and the Raiders are taking steps to make sure that does not happen. So appreciate that. Any questions or comments for Jeremy on this? Okay. Then we'll move on to agenda item 10. And we discussed the concept of an owner's representative or a compliance officer at the last board meeting, but Jeremy, I'll let you pick up the conversation from where we left it off there and the progress that has been made in the meantime.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. Last time you all got together, we presented you with a one-page summary of this concept of a compliance officer or owner's rep, which exists on any number of different similar developments that are out there or that have been recently constructed. We have gone through and evaluated, talked to other stadium authorities, worked with other folks relative to what is actually needed. It is staff's recommendation that what we do is actually bifurcate this concept into two component parts. We do believe that we need to hire a consultant to assist the Stadium Authority Board to make sure that we're understanding the construction process, that the list of development considerations that we just included are important. The Stadium Authority Board, is the owner of this stadium and ultimately the owner of the property underlying it. And so, as it has been explained to me by a couple of development professionals, when you're the owner, you build things with that in mind. And I have no doubt that the Raiders view themselves also as an owner. That is not intended to be at all any way pejorative or suggest anything otherwise. But we also understand that this is a complicated process and construction is a complicated process. It's staff's recommendation that in bifurcating it into two component parts, what we do is retain a construction expert to assist and advise the Stadium Authority Board from essentially October through February or until the issuance of the bonds, depending on exactly when that is. And then from that point forward, the Stadium Authority Board entertain the potential of retaining a compliance officer consistent with the needs of the development agreement as those are ultimately finalized in that development agreement when that document is completed. We had sort of presented it all as one thing last time, Mr. Chairman, and our research would suggest it really needs to be two things. So unless this board advises otherwise, what our intent would be, because it's a professional services contract, there's some flexibility in terms of how we can go out and hire someone. But we'd really like to do is we've had folks reach out to us. We'd like to reach back out to them, have some conversations with several experts in the field, get some feel for what they could do to assist the Stadium Authority as well as what the cost would be, and then bring back a preliminary engagement that would cover essentially October through February, probably mid-October through February from that initial agreement, and then for the Stadium Authority Board's approval, and then ultimately come back with a more extensive agreement probably after February when the development agreement is finalized.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Guerrero. And I guess I'd probably, just to make sure we don't limit ourselves, I think it's probably going to be through March because a part of this consideration is the financial capacity of the Stadium Authority between now and the time the bonds are issued. The bonds probably are not issued until March, and so we may not have the financial capability to bring on that next level of support until after that. So,
Mr. Chairman, if I may just add one thing. what has become apparent in our preliminary research is that, and I do want to make sure that it's clear and on the record, I don't necessarily believe that the same person will be fulfilling both obligations. Senate Bill 1, Section 35(2)D and E provides this concept of essentially an owner's rep type person that reviews all of the invoices, for example, that exists and stays up with the project. Those are the types of things that we are considering for the compliance officer and making sure that all the provisions of the act are essentially being fulfilled. That is a different role, and certainly one of the reasons we wanted to put this on the Stadium Authority Board's agenda is to make sure that it was public relative to this effort that we're going through and the type of folks that we were looking for.
They're operating without a compliance officer right now.
Questions, Mr. Guerrero, on that? Comments on that? Does that sound like something that is acceptable and we should move forward with? Nods on that?
Yeah,
Okay.
I think the flip side of the debate is who's qualified to do it if we don't bring someone in. And I think the message is we need that expertise at this juncture to make sure when we start the thing that, to Jeremy's always good points, that we've covered the bases.
Yeah. And frankly, it is probably helpful for our partners in this effort as well, in that now they are explaining things to either me or Jeremy about how this all works, and having someone that represents us that knows that already, I think would be beneficial. So both from a process standpoint as well as just a protection standpoint, I think that makes sense. So, okay, please follow through with your recommendation, and we'll look forward to hearing about your progress in October.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, we will open agenda item 11, which is a progress update on the enabling work MOU. Mr. Guerrero?
Mr. Chairman, for the record, Jeremy Aguero. Again, this was alluded to previously. The idea of this enabling work agreement is to ensure that the project is not delayed all the way until February. This provides preliminary approvals or a preliminary memorandum of understanding, if you will, between the Raiders organization and what is referred to as Las Vegas Stadium Events Company, LLC, this affiliate, and the Stadium Authority Board to make sure that we're covering all the bases, again, as Mr. Hahn indicated before, in terms of the work that is going to occur, is likely to occur between November and February. With that, if it would please the board, I'd like to turn it over to Mr. Arnold to walk through the enabling work MOU.
Yeah, please. Welcome, Mr. Arnold. And I'd just like to recognize Mr. Arnold is obviously from Houston, and our thoughts go out to you, your friends, and certainly all folks in that area who have had to deal with so much over the past several weeks. And that certainly includes you and your office. Mr. Arnold was constantly in touch with us along that path. We appreciate that diligence. We certainly would have understood if it was not possible or frankly just inappropriate at that time. But our thoughts will continue to go to that region of the country as well as Florida. But thanks for all that you did through that and for being here today.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your comments a lot. The city of Houston, as they say, Houston strong. That's the billboard everywhere over there. So we've got a long road ahead. Luckily, my family was safe and did not flood. We had a ton of friends who did and spent a bunch more time swinging crowbars and cutting out floors and sheetrock than a lawyer really should do. But we're on the road to recovery, and as the mayor said, the city's back at business, because if we're not back at business, we're not moving forward. So thank you very much for your comments. The enabling work agreement, Jeremy always gives me the exciting things to do, which is run through the legal documents. The enabling work agreement, everybody's calling it a memorandum of understanding. It's actually a binding agreement. We could call it what you want, but it is a binding agreement between us and LV Stadium Events Company, LLC. You will remember that the the legislation talks about a Stadco and a developer. The Raiders have, for financing purposes and otherwise, combined them into one. So LV Stadium Events Company LLC will be both the developer and then the operator of the stadium on a go-forward basis, and they're the party to this, this agreement. First page is the recitals that you guys are familiar with. It deals with mentioning the Oakland Raiders and the Senate Bill 1 and the fact that we are not ready for a development agreement just yet. It recognizes that one of the obstacles to that is getting a guaranteed maximum price and identifying fully the design builder. What this agreement also makes it clear is that the authorities, this is recital J, the authority's approval of this agreement and the go forward with that work doesn't take away the authority's right to approve things that the Senate Bill 1 allows us to approve on a go forward basis with regard to the developer, the construction contract, and as Jeremy pointed out, all the requirements in the act as to what a development agreement has in it. This is going to be done as we sit here right now on land that the Raiders affiliate owns, so the land has not yet been transferred to the Stadium Authority. So it is not on our land, it is on the Raiders' land. It is also at the Raiders' risk and expense. So if you go to Section 1 incorporates all of the recitals into the document. Section 2 on page 3 recognizes, as been said before, that the plan is to have the full development agreement before the board on or before February 2018. The development agreement, of course, would include things required by the act and other things that are negotiated between the parties. As Jeremy mentioned, a draft of that development agreement has been delivered to the Raiders and to their council. As Mr. Boudin mentioned, they've been focusing on their financing, so I suspect when they're done with that, since it closed today, they will get back with us on that development agreement, and we'll work forward to this February deadline. What is being approved in this agreement, and today, of course, is just a run through this agreement. If y'all would give me your thoughts and concerns, we can go have it revised if we need to bring it back to the board in October. What is being approved is what's called the enabling work. And the enabling work is listed on Exhibit A, and this may be a good time to sort of look at that enabling work right now. It is truly pre-development work, if you will, or early work. It is, essentially mobilization of the contractor on the site. It's clearing and grubbing the site. It's putting in the security fence and the guard shack. It's doing all your stormwater protection you have to do. It is geotechnical investigations, temporary utilities, and then once all of that is done, it goes into moving box culverts, mass excavation, and some deep foundation work. It is basically work that needs to be done before you really pour the main foundation of the building. That enabling work, having them being able to do that in November or in October after we approve this agreement, keeps from what I understand, the schedule intact for opening when the Raiders want to open the stadium. You will see in Section 4 of the agreement that we have some requirements for the enabling work contracts, that basically any contract that Stadco or the Raiders enter into to do this work has to have us indemnified. We have to be an additional insured. It has to have retainage. It has to have a warranty, all the things that you would look for. And that, to be honest, the Raiders are going to look for in those documents. Section 5 makes it clear that the work has to be done in a good workmanlike manner in accordance with the contracts that we've just described. It has to be used qualified workers. It has to be done in accordance with the terms of the Act. So their performance of this work has to comply with the terms of the Act, just like their performance of any of the later work would have to comply with the terms of the Act. We have set a 7-month time limit in this agreement. If at the end of 7 months the main development agreement is not done, then the Raiders can terminate this agreement. Of course, the provisions regarding exculpation of the authority for any responsibility for any of the work would survive. Along those lines, Section 5 makes it clear that Stadco and the Raiders are responsible for the work. They release us from any liability of the work. They do make it clear that their expenditures on this work counts towards their $100 million, which we figured was only fair because they're going to be spending real money towards the budget for this work. Section 7 is an indemnification and defense. It's a standard indemnification. We are indemnified for anything other than our gross negligence and willful misconduct. So if we don't go out onto the site, we should be fine. The indemnity survives the termination of this agreement. Section 8 is the lien provision from Senate Bill 1. It has to be done in a lien-free manner. And of course, when the land is ultimately transferred to us, it will have to have no liens on it, no mechanics liens, have to pay all their contractors, all of that. Section 9 is project reporting. This is a mutual section that obligates Stadco to furnish you guys monthly construction status reports. We have to agree on the form mutually of what kind of detail that you want. But once they start in November, we'll start to get a monthly progress report of what they're doing now, how far have they come, what the budget is like, that kind of thing. Section 10 is the miscellaneous section. Most of that language is fascinating boilerplate. So I'm not going to go through any of that in any kind of detail. So again, to recap, the main takeaways from this agreement is the definition of early work is in fact truly early work and site prep work. That's Exhibit A. We are indemnified by LV Stadium Events Company. We do not have any responsibility for the work. We are not a party to any of the contracts. We will be indemnified by the contractors. We will be an additional insured from the contractors. But again, we don't own the land yet, so it is all at the Raiders and LV Stadium Company's risk. I'm happy to answer any questions.
And lawyers may cringe at how I describe this agreement, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but generally at this point, the Raiders own a piece of property. They have every right, because they have a land permit, use permit, to go build a stadium on that property. What this agreement really does is brings both the Stadium Authority and the Raiders and their team together, saying we're going to do this in accordance with what we know will be in the development agreement, and the Stadium Authority is held harmless during that time frame, but we will credit the Raiders for the work that they do before that development agreement is signed. Is that?
That's correct. The Raiders could clearly have said, it's our land, we're going to go build whatever we want on there without engaging us. In the spirit of cooperation, we engaged them, they engaged us, and the principal benefit is we know what's going on and they get credit towards the $100 million, and we're all working together towards the development agreement rather than being surprised by it in February.
All right. Okay. Questions from the board? Mr. Hornbuckle?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. What is the transaction that triggers the land over to the Stadium Authority?
The Stadium Authority gets the land as a condition to the issuance of the bonds. So,
at that point, thank you.
Yeah, and that, my understanding is that'll be one of the transactions that happen when we have what is basically a closing, at least on the land itself.
Yeah, if we meet the time frame, or 2 months earlier than the 18-month or the extension to 18 months, would be in February. A whole bunch of stuff is going to happen in February, including the land transfer and the signing of the development agreement and the final signing of the lease and all of the other documents.
Okay. Mr. Evans?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Okay, I just wanted to thank you, Mr. Arnold. I just wanted to step through a few things for the record. Okay, Section 2 says that all the requirements of Senate Bill 1 or the original act in terms of procurement have to be met, meaning the 15% small business participation rate, as well as the spirit and intent of having a community benefits agreement in place. Is that a correct interpretation on my part?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay. Therefore, the other thing that I made note of is Section 9 discusses a reporting requirement, and my concern would be, depending on the timing, we may or may not have an oversight committee in place. So what I would want to be assured of is that we would do reporting on both the small business participation that occurs during the time covered by this enabling agreement, as well as we're doing reporting on the diversity in terms of the 5 entities that are described in Senate Bill 1.
Yes, I mean, right now, as I said before, the reports are going to be in a form mutually acceptable to us and to the raters. And I think the raters are here, and so they've heard your concern, and we will certainly carry that forward when we talk to them about the type of reports that are expected by the authority.
Right. And last, Mr. Chair, the reason why I'm being specific is because I just noted that they're both construction and professional service opportunities in Exhibit B-1. That's for the benefit of the public. They're both construction and professional service opportunities there, and we want to make sure that we meet all those requirements during this period. Plus get reports on them. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Evans. Good point. Any other questions or comments? Okay, great. We will bring this document back for approval in October. Okay, we'll close agenda item 11, open agenda item 12, and I'll ask Jeremy to walk us through the progress that has been made on the community benefits plan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For the record, Jeremy Aguero. Board members, inside your packet on tab number 12 is a document entitled Community Benefits Plan Conceptual Outline. This is a summary of the progress that has been made to date. It is intentionally a conceptual plan as we work together to ultimately round out some of the items that are listed as pending and then ultimately draft a document around those items. Mr. Chairman, what I intend to do is just walk through each one of these items, talk through them with the board. If there are questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them. The name is the Community Benefits Plan. I do think that sometimes it's referred to as the Community Benefits Agreement. Sometimes it's referred to as the Community Benefits Plan. This is the proper terminology that is referenced in Senate Bill 1. We have been trying, Mr. Arnold certainly impresses upon me that in using the words that are used in Senate Bill 1 are always important to us. So you will hear me always refer to this as the Community Benefits Plan. I do want to reference that there are actually 2 statutory requirements in Senate Bill 1 that we're going to be speaking about today. Senate Bill 1, Section 29.5 is the Community Benefits Plan section, and I've actually provided it there for the board. The second one, which is an independent section of Senate Bill 1, is Section 31.5, which deals with the local small business hiring requirement. The fact that these are 2 separate sections of Senate Bill 1, the fact that they do have some overlap makes this process more complicated here than it might be in other situations. And so I will mention that as we go through. However, I do want to make sure that I make the point that these are separate and distinct sections of Senate Bill 1. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I've provided some subtitles that aren't actually part of Senate Bill 1, but just to make the review of this a little easier. One is the purpose, and then the second is the oversight of Senate Bill 1, Section 29.5. The purpose: the developer partner and the stadium events company shall develop a community benefits plan to ensure the greatest possible participation by all segments of the local community in the economic opportunities available in connection with the design, construction, and operation of the National Football League Stadium project developed by the developer partner and operated by the Stadium Events Company. Okay, so there's a lot of words in there. We're going to talk about how we're effectuating that in a number of the sections that follow, but that's really, there seems to be a lot of conversation about what Senate Bill 1 says or what Senate Bill 1 doesn't say. This is specifically the quote out of Senate Bill 1. So this is the landscape that we are using, or at least the structure that we're using to guide all of these conversations. In terms of oversight, a Stadium Community Oversight Committee must be created to carry out the community benefits plan developed pursuant to subsection 1. The Stadium Community Oversight Committee is hereby authorized to enforce the provisions the provisions of the community benefit plan, which it was created to carry out. Okay, so Senate Bill, the second section of Section 29.5 talks about this concept of oversight, enforcement, the idea that they are there to ensure that this plan ultimately is effectuated as it's proposed. So those are really the framework that we're going to talk about as we go through this entire document. The third section on page 1 is phases of the project to be covered by the plan. Senate Bill 1 is very clear about the fact that the community benefits plan has to include design, has to include construction, and has to include operations. And Mr. Evans and Mr. Arnold's conversation from just a moment ago, I think, is germane. And that is the idea that the concept is that the spirit of Senate Bill 1 is already being effectuated because design is taking place, because these early works are going to take place. We understand that the Raiders are doing many things already, some of which they've discussed with this board in order to try to meet the spirit of Senate Bill 1 in this regard, both in terms of sections 29.5 and 31.5. There is agreement that those three elements all need to be included. There is a note that falls underneath that, and that reads, this includes services and goods contracts and employment, as well as procurement contracts and vendor contracts, because construction can be complicated and operations can be complicated and there's significant procurement. We don't know exactly what way the form in which that's ultimately going to take, and it seemed some vision here, but there is generally the understanding that when we're thinking about what it means to be in connection with the design, construction, and operations, that it includes concepts of purchases and contracts that may happen for whether that's a prime contractor, a subcontractor, or the procurement of supplies, that those concepts will be included as part of the community benefits plan. The fourth element that's on page 1 is the oversight committee makeup. Currently, we're imagining a 7-member committee, 2 members appointed by the Stadium Authority, including the Stadium Authority will identify the chair of that committee. 2 members appointed by the governor in consultation with legislative leadership, and then 3 members appointed by Stadco and DevCo relative to that oversight committee as well. A couple of notes relative to the Oversight Committee. The Oversight Committee will not have a budget, but will be staffed as necessary by the Stadium Authority. Committee members will be volunteer, unpaid positions. This is consistent with the same language that was used to create the Stadium Authority Board that you all serve on today. These will be unpaid positions. Committee meetings will be subject to the open meeting law. The idea is to have as much transparency here as possible to ensure that members of the public are able to understand what is happening with the community benefits plan and its various elements overall. The final element on page 1 is the hiring targets component. As I mentioned, this is where the overlap gets somewhat complicated. Local small businesses, prime contractors must subcontract at least 15% of the aggregate value of work subcontracted to third parties in connection with construction of the project to local small businesses that are defined in Senate Bill 1, Section 31.5, Sub 2. Some of you may have seen, and I had it in my staff report, and I probably should have brought it up then, that we have had some inquiries in terms of what does it mean to be a local small business? How are these revenue targets defined? And we've gone through the exercise of trying to provide some clarity there. But ultimately, the goal here is to ensure that at least 15% of the subcontracted work goes out. And I think it's important to make the point. I think everyone recognizes that in some of the areas of a trade, particularly when it comes to construction, meeting the 15% requirement may be something that is very easily achievable, or even something that can be better than 15%. In other areas of construction, that may be very difficult. Senate Bill 1 does provide the idea that in the event that the developer determines after significant inquiry and trying to make it work that they can't get to the 15%, that they can come back to this board and say, we tried, but with this, for this particular element of the project, it's just not possible to do, and so we'd like to ask for a waiver to that. But again, the idea would be to try to avoid that wherever possible. I think all parties would like to avoid that. And we also have the ability of saying, hey, look, if we're able to get to 22% in one area, and that means we can only get to 7 in another, that if we can continue to work together to try and, again, as Senate Bill 1 says, ensure the greatest possible participation and connection, the goal is to try and get as close to that 15% or exceed it if at all possible. On the top of page 2, you'll notice that there is a portion in brackets relative to the hiring targets. These include both workforce diversity targets as well as certified business enterprises, sometimes referred to as disadvantaged business enterprises. And Mark will correct me if I say this wrong, but in Houston it's hubs, historically underrepresented businesses. Underutilized, excuse me, businesses. We have taken the time to try and look up these type of agreements in whatever form they take from around the United States. I think we've looked at almost every stadium or arena that has been constructed so that we understand what the parameters of this look like. We've also taken the time to better understand what our demographics look like here in Southern Nevada so that we can be mindful in coming up with these targets. We have met with the Raiders, we have met with their development team, and what is clear is that they too have gone through the exercise of trying to understand this, but that additional work is needed to try and round out how these could be structured, not only because it's important to make sure that whatever targets are ultimately identified are the right targets, that they make sense for our community, but I think we also have to be mindful that we have this additional layer on top of this, which is the small business requirement, and the fact that there could be some push-pull between these various requirements in Senate Bill 1. We want to make sure that we are doing it right and that we are mindful relative to that. In our meeting on Tuesday, both with the Raiders organization as well as their development team, there's an agreement that they really felt like they needed to do some additional research relative to this, and they felt like they could come back in a couple of weeks with that research and we could kind of round that out. So we'll look forward to bringing that back to the Stadium Authority Board. The first full section on...
Jeremy, before you move on, I'd just like to pause and see if the board has any questions on that. It's really that additional layer of complexity, and I would point out that the 15% small business requirement, one, is either somewhat uniquely or uniquely written in Nevada's statute. That concept is, particularly the way it is structured in our statute, was not found elsewhere, and it's the law. The goals for the community benefit plan are to be negotiated, but the 15% is the law, and those two concepts have at times the ability to be in competition with one another, and that competition is what has really required additional research in order to really fully understand what the demographics of the community as well as the construction industry itself and different sectors of the construction industry. I had said previously in the meeting that the 15% small business requirement is a very strong, aggressive requirement. I continue to believe that. I think contractors for the Raiders believe that as well. And so that is the issue that has arisen as the one it's taken more time in order to get this document completely done. So I think it's important that if the board has questions on that now, might be a good time to ask. Mr. Evans?
Yeah, thank you. My question would be or my understanding is, and then I'll lead to the question, the original intent of the community benefits plan, and I'll make sure I use the proper nomenclature moving forward. The original intent behind that was to make sure that there was diversity and inclusion in terms of 3 key things: employment, procurement, and community engagement, parentheses, nonprofits, and other interactions. So on the procurement and the employment end of things, can we expect to see some study done to see how do things break down in terms of social, gender, ethnicity breakdowns, just to get a feel for what's the universe out there, both in terms of employment as well as procurement, so that as we move forward with the oversight committee, we'll have an idea of some good objectives to see.
Sure. Mr. Evans, for the record, Jeremy Aguero, the answer to that question is yes. As your staff, we've gone through some of that exercise already. We've looked at the demographics of our community. We've tried to break it down by sector of the economy. We have pulled, as I think you probably know as well, the DBE registrations that we have here in the state of Nevada. All of that having been said, we are also mindful that it's the rater's obligation to develop the community benefit plan itself. And so they are going through that exercise of doing that diligence on their end as well. And frankly, they have some folks that have done these all over the United States or developed projects all over the United States and may have more information than we do here locally. In terms of the sub breakdown of ethnicities or the sub breakdown of race or those type of things, what we found, at least preliminarily, is that the targets have a tendency to be more aggregate in nature. However, we are certainly looking at each one of those to make sure that we're not leaving anything off the table. If that's not even the right way to say it, that we're not being mindful of any subgroup that may be reflected there. However, I do want to make sure that it's clear, and I don't want to create an unreasonable expectation. The more granular that those targets ultimately become, the more difficult they're going to be to monitor, and frankly, the amount of information we have becomes much more limited. So I would imagine that the targets, whatever those may ultimately be, are going to be at a little bit of a higher level than that, although they will be evaluated, at least by us, in thinking about what the community's demographic breakdown looks like and what its economic breakdown looks like in terms of the number of businesses and type of businesses that exist here.
And Mr. Chair, I just had one other follow-up question. When we did a press conference, it was originally the spirit and intent of State Senator Ford at the time that there be 5 entities involved in terms of the board composition. Should I hold that for now, the discussion about board composition, or go ahead and ask my question right now, Mr. Chair?
Go ahead, Mr. Evans.
Okay.
Fine.
Originally, when that press conference was held, is with the understanding that there would be 5 entities that would be represented on the oversight committee. And again, for the benefit of the public, it was the Asian Chamber, the Latin Chamber, the Urban Chamber, the LGBTQ Chamber, and then a Veterans Affiliation Group. So I just want to make sure that as we move forward, that all parties concerned keep that spirit and intent in mind for the oversight committee. And if I'm off, let's have now be the time that somebody tells me that I'm off or that we need to make a course correction.
Mr. Evans, we'll certainly take it in consideration and go back and evaluate that. At this point, the board has the ability to make those appointments. We haven't gotten into the details relative to whom might be included. However, I do think it's important as we go through, each one of those organizations is reflected in this document and is considered relative to their input. So there's certainly nothing stopping any or all of those folks from being appointed to the open positions, just depending on the appointing person in that particular case.
Questions, comments, Mr. Hornbuckle?
Mr. Chair, Jeremy, remind me, for small businesses, is this a public work project or other? Because it's 20 versus 10 million, if I remember your...
I'm sorry, I'm not following your question, sir.
What's the definition of small business? Because I'm reading your frequently asked question definition, and I'm asking, is this a public work project that's defined at 20 million, or an other construction project that's defined at 10?
Those are the individual requirements for the individual businesses that fall in. If you'll bear with me for a second.
Are we defined as a public works project?
I can help with
okay,
that.
Yeah, thank you.
Mr. Hornbuckle, we are defined as a public works project.
So it helps.
Those limitations or criteria for qualification as a small business does not relate, though, to the contract that they would sign to work on the stadium. It refers to work that they've done prior to that contracting elsewhere. So if they worked on other public works projects or other non-public works projects.
Okay. Thank you.
And I'll just make one other comment. Jeremy, you had talked about how other community benefit plans, whether they call them that elsewhere or not, have been structured. And you had mentioned that they tend to be, the goals tend to be aggregate in nature and not subdivided from there. As far as I have seen, and you correct me if I'm wrong, they don't just tend to be that way, they are universally that way. Is that correct?
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman. Of all the ones that we have reviewed, we've seen none that have granular targets.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
With your permission? Thank you, sir. Number 2 on page 2 is the funding for the community benefits plan. Certainly this has been a big part of the discussion relative to how the plan itself would be funded and how it would be evaluated. The idea here being that the developer, the STADCO, DevCo, that group will ultimately be responsible for making sure that the elements of the plan are funded and are effectuated and be held accountable to the outcomes of those. This language reads, STADCO DevCo acknowledges and agrees that the implementation of and compliance with its commitments as set forth in the plan will require commercially reasonable expenditure of funds, foregoing certain revenue streams, incurring higher operating expenses, and distributing other meaningful resource allocations, including things like volunteer hours, either directly by STADCO or DevCo, or by those charged with carrying out the various provisions of the plan on STADCO or DevCo's behalf. All parties acknowledge the resource allocations necessary to effectuate the plan are significant, and some may not be readily quantifiable. I do want to make the point, which I think is important, is that as the Raiders sort of talked about their approach to this plan and how it would work, is that it's not just them. It's not just STADCO. It's not just DevCo. It is the prime contractors. It is subcontractors. It is the trade unions that they're working with. It is the universities that they're working with, all of which are engaged in essentially effectuating the provisions of this plan. The notes here are also important. Nothing in this plan shall be interpreted to require that STADCO or any other party allocate resources or otherwise incur costs that, other than that on a commercially reasonable basis. Again, ensuring that the idea is that they effectuate this plan, but they're not asked to go beyond that which would be commercially reasonable. NFL grants and funding. This is, of course, a very important part of any NFL team in any location and can be very significant for our community. STADCO, DevCo, and the Raiders will work with the National Football League to obtain grants to fund facilities improvements for local community athletic and education organizations. They have a long history of doing that in other communities. I won't go through all of those here, but we wanted to make sure that the community benefit plan reflected that. There are some certain prime contractor requirements in Senate Bill 1, Section 29.5. And again, these relate only to the local small business requirements, but I do think that they are important and were worthy of referencing as part of this document. Number 1, a prime contractor must allow subcontracted small local businesses to be covered by any bond or insurance of the prime contractor. However, it's important to note that the prime contractor may recover proportional costs from the small local business. The idea is helping those small local businesses reduce the cost of insurance or bonds in order to make it easier for them. Number 2, the contractor may not impose any requirements on the small local business relating to the employees selected by the small local business to perform the subcontracted work. That subcontractor is allowed to be independent relative to his or her workforce. Prime contractors must provide a mentorship program to develop the skills necessary to carry out the subcontracted work.
Yes, Jimmy, I don't think you need to necessarily read the law all the way through. So
I will accelerate my pace. My apologies, Mr. Chairman. The last element there is that the failure to comply should be considered material breach of contract. Bid package structuring is there. This essentially says the bid packages will be designed to allow for maximum participation by local, small, women, minority-owned businesses. The structure of a bid can be very important, as we've learned, and this is included. Accelerated payment processing for small businesses. Oftentimes, cash flow can be a problem for small businesses. Stadco and DevCo will develop a program to allow that to continue. Business retention plan. Stadco and DevCo will develop and maintain a business retention plan for targeted businesses. Monitoring and reporting. I will just be very brief on this. There's 3 elements designed. Number 1, Stadco and DevCo generally will institute commercially reasonable internal controls to make sure that this happens. They will be charged with ensuring that this plan is going on for all their contractors and subcontractors. During construction, they will provide monthly reports relative to the small business requirement. They will do quarterly reports on any other hiring targets. In terms of reporting to the Oversight Committee post-construction, the idea here is that they will provide quarterly reports until the Oversight Committee is shown that they are in compliance with the targets. Thereafter, they will provide annual reports unless they're shown to be out of compliance, and then they will go back to quarterly reports until they're shown in 2 consecutive quarters to be in compliance. The raters have also indicated that they will continue to produce the corporate responsibility report, the community report that was shared with this board last go-around. Remedy in the event targets are not being met. There are 2 paths here. The first one is the idea that since Stadco and DevCo are going to be charged with the administration of that they say, oh, we have identified that there was a problem with our plan, and to the extent that they identify that problem, they're required to bring a remedial plan back to the Oversight Committee, and that remedial plan cannot reduce any of the benefits without the approval of that committee. To the extent that the Oversight Committee determines non-compliance, they provide notice to the raters. If the raters concur, they provide a remedial plan. If they don't concur, they determine why they believe they are in compliance. If the parties do not agree to a resolution, notice will be provided to the stadium authority, and we'll need to come up with a process to resolve that dispute. Project labor agreement, the community benefits plan essentially says to the extent that there is a project labor agreement, it will reference and be consistent with this plan. Community access programs. These are things like providing programs for military families, disadvantaged and at youth risk, low-income residents, including things like discounted ticket opportunities will be included as part of the plan. Community outreach and collaboration. Mr. Chairman, there's a number of things here. I will try to be brief, but I do think that these are important. Stadco and DevCo will utilize local partnerships to communicate opportunities and implement strategies. The collaborative partners will include the Latin Chamber of Commerce, the National Association of Minority Contractors, the Women Business Enterprise Council, the Nevada Contractors Association, the Western Regional Minority Suppliers Development Council, the Urban Chamber, the Asian Chamber, and the Gay and Lesbian Chamber of Commerce. Again, I won't go through those when they're referenced in other places, but I did want to make sure that the record reflected, I think, what Mr. Evans was asking about the inclusionary nature of all of that. Stadco will have their contractors maintain an internet presence to make sure that these opportunities are clear. Stadco will encourage the support of community outreach programs designed to educate and encourage target businesses and worker opportunities. Stadco and the Oversight Committee will both engage where helpful all of those organizations that I previously mentioned. Workforce training and development. I'm now on page 5. Again, this is a little bit lengthy. I'll try to just summarize this. The first paragraph probably being most important. Well, they're all important. I don't want to characterize it that way. Workforce capacity will be developed through a number of things. And the idea that the raters have impressed upon us and we have reflected here is the idea of building capacity through community partnerships. This includes working with unions, working with prime contractors, working with subcontractors, working with universities and other workforce development programs to prepare and develop pre-apprentices as well as the workforce within these targeted groups. Stadco will provide support services in terms of applicants taking classes and those type of things. They will consider training programs specific to develop vocational skills training and the like that are included included here. To address capacity building for small, women, and minority-owned businesses, they will develop a local small business enterprise resource center that will provide tools to strengthen and expand these. They will work with trade unions to develop apprenticeship programs and provide opportunities for low-income residents through short-term hands-on activities. They will partner with veterans organizations, including the Helmets to Hard Hats. They will work with faith-based organizations and community throughout the community to develop and communicate where these opportunities exist. They will work with sourcing agencies to make sure that workers that may not have them have clothes and boots and tools to be able to participate in these activities. They'll maintain relationships with the various chambers that are included there. As a note there at the bottom, they will also develop a first source employment program that creates a link between those that are trained and the employment opportunities to make sure that when they are being trained, they actually have the opportunity to be on the job. They will have internship programs that included. The Raiders Foundation, again, this document was handed out to everyone. I don't want to give this short shrift for even a moment, but the Raiders really have done relatively remarkable things as part of their foundation and as part of their community outreach. I had the opportunity to sit down with their local person that's already on the ground here. I think many of you had the opportunity to meet her a meeting or two ago. They're already remarkably active in the community in this regard. Mr. Chairman, on the end of page 7, the Community Benefits Plan staffing, DevCo will appoint a Community Benefits Director throughout the construction and development process, and then during operations, they will have a point person that is the designee, that's a liaison between the Oversight Committee and the STADCO, in that case, development. In terms of a living wage, they've agreed that STADCO and DevCo will encourage and support living wage programs. We also have an audit provision here. There's always sensitivities, and to be honest with you, it's made very complicated by the number of people that are involved in effectuating all of the things that are here in terms of the audit. We are mindful of the enforcement and oversight provision, so we will work on something in that regard, but it remains pending today. Again, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate your indulgence. Perhaps the amount of time that we've worked on it made me be a little bit more detailed than I otherwise would have been, but I appreciate the indulgence to let me walk through all 7 pages.
And we certainly appreciate all the work that you've done on this, Jeremy. Thank you. Questions for Jeremy, Mr. Evans?
Actually, I'll defer to others because I know I've been hogging the time up, and then I'll be glad to come back after if others have questions.
We're waiting for your lead.
All right, I'll take it away then. Okay, first of all, I want to say thank you very much to the Raiders as well as to Jeremy and staff for working on this, and Mr. Arnold. Just a couple of points here, and I'll make this offer from the start. If there's a way for me as a board member to be involved or engaged offline, perfectly willing to do that to help continue to move this forward. I'll come back to the point about board composition because I do think that there was a spirit and intent there that we still need to figure out how to fold that in because in the interest of managing expectations, that was definitely put out there and it was communicated. I'll put my chamber hat on for a minute now. It was communicated to myself and my colleagues that we'd have direct representation with the Oversight Committee, and there may be others as well that want to be involved. So again, I'll be willing to work offline on that. The question I want to have as far as the work that's been done to date and that'll happen in the foreseeable future related to construction services, is it possible to get the reporting done in terms of both what I would call direct construction services as well as professional services so that we can get a feel for how we're doing in terms of both the small business participation rate as well as eventually what the Oversight Committee will view?
Mr. Evans, for the record, Jeremy Aguero. I think it was last meeting or the meeting before that Mr. Hornbuckle indicated sort of the expectation that the form of that reporting is going to be critical to the ultimate approval of this part of this process. We have absolutely been working on that, and once we have all of the structure and elements, we will be bringing that reporting instrument back to the board to make sure that it is part of the community benefit plan that is ultimately approved.
Okay. All right.
Thank you, Mr. Evans. Anybody else?
One additional question, Mr. Chair. Jeremy, you kept referencing the word "they will." I realize this is a conceptual outline, and it's not done until it's done. But in your estimation, like looking at workforce development, how far is "they will" agreed upon? I mean, where are we in the overall essence of this agreement? Is this our wish, or is this the things that have been basically understood to this point in time?
I think it's much more that these are the things that are understood at this time. And look, the Raiders folks are here. I don't want to speak on their behalf, but the conversations that we've had is we wanted to bring forward those conceptual elements that are consistent with the agreement. And I say that with where we have gotten thus far. So I do believe these are things that are not up in the air or still big question marks. These are the ones that we believe to be what you will ultimately see in the final document.
I'll just say, ultimately, at least from my perspective, and I certainly open to opinions and conversations along the way as we finalize this, what matters are the results. We're certainly open to input on how we get toward those results, and I know the Raiders are as well. But there are going to be lots of different opinions on the process for achieving the results. Frankly, as long as the results are there, how we get there, let's pick a path, let's pick a solid path. We need to have a thoughtful process to get there, but I do realize that there are going to be any number of opinions on some of the issues or the topics that you've identified in this outline. Some of the things that are in brackets that are very much results oriented really are the reason the rest of this exists, and we'll be certain. I'll be certainly focused on those. And from a process standpoint, we've got a long relationship ahead with the Raiders. We'll learn as we go, I'm sure, and I'm sure they will as well. So anyway, I thought I'd just make that comment. So anything else before we move on? Okay. We'll close agenda item 12. Does it make sense to open 13 through 20?
Yes.
20?
Yes. 19.
19, and we can deal with those 7 different agenda items kind of in the same way as they are, pretty much all the same thought process, just different individual topics. So please, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll turn it over to Mr. Arnold. With your permission, he's going to go through the resolutions.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As the chairman mentioned, this is items 13 through 19. It's not for action. It's just for information. It's the draft of the resolutions. Just to refresh everyone's memory, Section 29 of Senate Bill 1 says the Stadium Authority shall negotiate and may enter into the development agreement and lease agreement only if certain things have happened. And so these are the only if things that need to happen and need to have been found. And Section 37, of course, of Senate Bill 1 says if certain of these things don't happen and we don't enter into a development agreement and a lease agreement within now 18 months from when the bill was passed, then the Stadium Authority dissolves. So this is more towards what has to do, and it's